Hello everyone. Today we're going to take a look at React Router version 7. But before we get started, you can find all of this in an advanced format with consultations and some additional materials in the Telegram channel linked in the description. The very first link will be the Telegram channel, just follow it and subscribe. But what are we going to start with? So what's the point and why is there such a big interest specifically in version 7? For the most part, before all the well-known events with Next.js, we had something called Create React App. In fact, everyone should know that using Create React App used to be a rather inefficient way to start an application, which is why most people would start with Webpack, configuring Webpack themselves. But to put it bluntly, that's not always fast and not always convenient. Or then Vite appeared, which made this process easier. And recently, Create React App was removed altogether, so now there's a kind of vacuum in its place. Recently, something happened with Next.js specifically, a leak related to headers. Again, the point here is that if you use Next.js as a full-stack solution, it's not a very good choice for the simple reason that Next.js isn't really designed specifically for full-stack development, but rather more for optimization in terms of loading, working with static files, and so on. In other words, it's more about rendering views than handling backend tasks, so the backend should be separate. Nevertheless, there weren't really any good ways to start an application besides Vite, because roughly speaking, there was a sort of vacuum. But now React Router has been updated, and it has introduced a feature that allows you to start a project using React Router. So now we have a new approach to working with our router in the sense that we have a mini framework that allows us to set up our routing, as well as conveniently handle loading, process forms easily, and so on. Basically, it's the same thing as Next.js, just in a lighter format. But if we go to the installation section, we'll see an example of how all of this works. That is creating our application, navigating, installing, and so on. Next, we have an overview of our routing here. And here we move on specifically to Vite. So when we generate our application, we see something like this. I added the utils, and everything else is basically what gets generated by the React Router start from the installation using npx. Therefore, the main file we'll be working with when using React Router as a framework is root tsx, which is basically where most of our work takes place. Here we render our component using outlet, and all our components will be projected through the outlet. There's also the error boundary, which will catch errors and display them in a clear and visually appealing way. In addition to that, there's the layout, again, which handles our layout and transforms the page the way we need it. So here we have meta tags, some link elements, our scripts, scroll restoration, and so on. And in the children, our components project the header, which contains our headings, and the links are, again, metadata for handling our additional, well, not just metadata, but any kind of connections, including our fonts and so on. All of this is located right here. Actually, this isn't metadata, I misspoke. It's specifically the links to our fonts and other resources. But besides the fact that we have the root tsx file, now I want to recommend that you join my Telegram channel in the description, because that's where the very first and newest information comes out. You can get consultations, you can get interview opportunities, advanced materials, cheat sheets, and participate in contests. There are always contests going on there, so all of that is right there. Go to the description. The very first link will be to my Telegram channel, so subscribe. We also have a root.ts file. In this file, we will specifically define certain paths to our pages. As we know, we have an index page. To specify that we have an index, we need to set the path to our index page so that everything gets rendered. Also, if we need to define a path to our page, set up a layout and specify the page that will open for a particular path, we use a construction like this. That is, in root.ts is another way we work with our roots when we define them. You can see here that we first specify the path, and then we specify the page. But if we pass something else as the third parameter, we can even pass a root here. In general, there are no restrictions here. Here, I just passed an index, basically just to show that this works as well. So in this configuration, our root acts as something like a layout. This about tsx will be our layout, and this page will be rendered specifically onto the about. Or we might have another scenario where we only need the layout without modifying our URL. In other words, roughly speaking, to create a layout for a group of pages without changing our URL, without adding any basically, we can just write our layout, specify the path to our layout, and here in the same format, pass, for example, the index and the root. But if we also need a path and we don't want to use a root, or I don't know why, for example, we might not want to. We can add a prefix. Again, as we understand, we can use the prefix separately, the layout separately, and the root separately. So it's quite flexible in that we can combine these and do things the way that's convenient for us. As we understand it, a prefix is essentially the creation of a specific group of our pages, the ones we project here, which will open using our, well, not using, but by the todos route. When we open by todos, the first thing we'll see is our index page, obviously, and also our page with a colon, well, not a colon, but with the path that we'll specify here. A colon indicates a dynamic path, meaning our dynamic parameters like IDs and anything else we'll be working with, which we'll take a closer look at a bit later. This kind of configuration is our root TS file, where we specifically, so to speak, map our paths to the pages that are in our application. Now, this is how it works. In addition to this, besides the fact that it can work in a framework format, so to speak, here we also have a description of how it works. We can absolutely work in our old formats, specifying our browser router, anything at all, hash routers, defining routes in this way. So if we need to work with some other framework, or if for some reason we can't use our React router as a framework, or if we already have an existing project and just want to update it to get some new features and that's it, then we can absolutely work in the declaration format. That is not by generating a new project where we would already have some routes that we would define in that format, where we have routes, in other words, basically making our own mini framework, but instead we work in the usual way, just like we used to before. Okay, let's move on. I've basically shown everything. Besides that, well, here, yes, this is in the old format again, where we can define everything in this way. So the current format is the framework mode, and the data mode is how we used to define what our pages would look like and how navigation would work, just like before. Here we can see how it all looks, including the loaders. Those who have watched the advanced material will remember what a loader is and how it all works. For those who don't know, we're about to take a look at what loaders are. Or something like that. So the current format simply describes our previous interaction with React Router in terms of our object and our components. In general, there aren't really any major changes between this format and the previous one. The only real change is specifically in how we work with the framework. We've looked at routing, so let's maybe start up our application and take a look, navigate through our pages. Let's start it up. Let's see what we have here. Dev, okay? npm run dev. We're starting our application. So what routes do we have? Let's see, here we should have a home route. We see that it's home TSS. Let's go into home TSX and we see our hello. The meta information that we have, roughly speaking, my whole screen isn't being recorded here, but we can see new React Router app, and our information is going to be duplicated as meta titles. We see our hello, and then what do we have in route TSX? We have about, well, let's go to about. Here it's also not very clearly visible, but we see about and profile. The same thing with about. We go into about and see that about is being used as a layout. Well, we can just write layout here, then save it, and we see that everything is working. Hot module replacement is working, the page reloaded, and we see the layout and our profile. Profile is our nested component, which we are, roughly speaking, passing in here. In other words, we moved it here, and now for our abouts, we'll have our current layout and our component rendered. We also have a setup where we just have a layout and a todos prefix. Well, let's see what it looks like if we enter todos. For now, without any additional parameters, we can see that our todos component is being rendered. If we go into todos, we see that we have the first item. And in todos, our index pages, again, todos, index TSXs. We go in here and see first we have our todos here and then the error boundary. Now I'll show you exactly how error handling works. If we have some kind of error during the rendering of our page, for example, there could be an error here. Well, for instance, what could happen? Let's say we output something like this here, we save it, then go here and see that our error boundary has caught everything and is highlighting our error very nicely. How can we understand this? Well, for example, we took the error and added an exclamation mark. That is, our error boundary caught the error, and we can handle it in some way, including possibly with some additional loading or extra processing. Basically, we can do whatever we want with it. Okay, now let's refresh. The page has been refreshed. Now let's remove our error, and our error boundary works. Next, remember that we have routes TS. We can see that we have our ddynamic parameters here, which are handled in todo index TSX. This is where things get interesting, because if we for example, enter 1, we get a really long lengthy loading process. Why is it so long? Let's find out. We go in here and see our loaders. Well, we see something. Now, let's take a closer look at what this actually is. So first, we have a loader. When we define something in a component and want to fetch something from the server, we basically need to specify a loader, more or less like this. In other words, the current loader function will be executed on the server. That is, before the page is rendered, every time we fetch our data, the data will be retrieved on the server, then passed into our component, and the component will be delivered. If we want to pass our values in the client-side format, in other words, to have everything executed on the client. For those who didn't understand what I'm talking about, well, let's say we add a console log start like start request. This is just to see where the request is happening. If we reload our page, we see that the request starts here and it goes through. Well, that's a deliberate delay. But if we want to work with a loader that runs not on the server but on the client, we have a client loader. What is that? I'll show you now. We insert it here, save it, bam. We see that something is happening here too. Here we got an error. Why is there an error? Let's take a look. So we have params. We see that we have params. So we just need to destructure params. Now we see there won't be an error. We refresh the page and see that the rendering takes quite a long time for the simple reason that we have a delay. We see that the delay is intentionally set with a 3-second timeout. What should we do in a situation like this? When we have a long request and we want to get the data on the client side. So how can we check this? For example, let's add a console log, write start request from client, save it, go here and view the code. Then we open the console, refresh our page and see start request from client and wait for everything to execute and for our rendering to appear. How can we create our loader to basically get our loader, so to speak? Well, loader in the sense of how we can show that we're waiting for something to execute. It's very simple. We have another function, hydration fallback, which tells us that while we haven't received the data yet, well, it displays our loader. So if we refresh our page as it is now, we see that we have loading to do, which is being handled. This is in the context of the loader. In addition to having a loader, well, which we pass through, roughly speaking, by returning some information from the loader, it will end up in our props. Here in our props, we actually have a lot of useful information. The first is our params, meaning the params that we pass with our URL. This is loader data. The information in our loader is action data, that is the information we send in forms, and matches is, roughly speaking, information about our page specifically, the URL, post name, and so on. Now, speaking about working with forms, when working with a form, we can work either on the server or on the client. Here, a small form has been created, and it's also important to mention that for the form to work properly, we need to use a special form component provided by React Router. And when working with the form, let's say we send something like create comment, we submit something, we click something, we can see that our data is received specifically on the server. If we want to receive it on the client side, well, nothing stops us from simply commenting out these lines, uncommenting these ones, and then after coming here, we wait a bit for something to load, open the console, and do our checks as well. We can see that we've received our data from here. So essentially, we get the ability to handle form processing both on the client and on the server. However, this again can come with certain issues. We remember what happened with Next.js regarding that vulnerability with the header, where by passing it, we could bypass all authentication and gain access to some confidential data. Although, in general, this should never have been done, considering that, well, Next.js is ultimately not a solution for backend developers, and a backend developer understands that there must be filtering, there must be certain filters in place to prevent a situation where a user simply bypasses something, gains access to a page, and that's it. But in this case, we have filtering and validation of our parameters, which simply wouldn't allow us to do anything wrong. Nevertheless, we do have the ability to at least handle our requests on the client side. That's pretty cool. And on the server, we can connect something to the scope where we can make some requests. But again, this whole setup isn't super secure, so that's how it is. We can see that all our parameters are being passed into all our functions. Here you can check what is being passed in, and here as well you can see what is being passed in. But I think the main point is clear. It's just a regular function that takes a URL and makes a request. It's done this way simply for convenience. Nothing supernatural, really. The main point is precisely our work with the router in the format of a separate file that describes specific URLs and page handlers. Then there are specific functions for handling our data. client router, client loader, loader, and so on. It's very similar to, and in general overlaps with the Remix, which we used before and still have now, which just changed its form. In short, the point is that React Router is turning into a mini framework. Let's go to our React router and take a look at something else. Besides what I've already shown, there's also a way to work with optional segments and with splats, that is with our asterisk, basically to combine all the other routes so that they match with the current router. So the only thing left to add and to look at here is specifically working with optionals. In other words, basically how we handle our routes are our optional segments and this merging that we have. Next up are router modules. What do we have here? Well, the loader, as I mentioned, is for handling things on our server. The client loader is on the client, the action on the server, the client actions on the client. Error bundle is for handling our errors. Hydration fallback is to show how our page is loading and what issues we might have there. Headers are for specifying headers, that is the response header, what exactly is being returned. Where did we have them? I think they were somewhere around here. So here we're simply passing our response headers for the server. Handle headers are specifically for processing our route matches. Here we can specify a more detailed configuration. Links are for linking our favicons, preloaders, styles, and so on. Meta information and should validate, basically. Here we can work with, well, the cache. If we have the option, if we want something to be validated, in other words, if something is in our cache and we want it to be updated, we use should revalidate so that according to a certain rule, maybe by setting a timestamp that will be calculated and checked to see if it's okay or not, we would simply check and provide the ability to revalidate. Next, the rendering strategies are just presented here in a very simple way. Again, we have another file that tells us how things work. So here we have working with placecoder, and here we have working with our SSR. By default, SSR is enabled, and if we want to work with client-side rendering, we turn it off. If we want to work with SSR, we enable it. As for statistics with static pre-rendering, roughly speaking, we have a function here where we specify which pages should be pre-rendered. This is SSG static site generation. We just specify that we will have static. These are the main path, about, and contacts. Here we pass exactly those URLs that need to be statically generated. If we talk about analogies, we have next.js, where there is get static paths, to which we pass these URLs that need to be rendered. Date. Loading continues from here. Here we have different formats for working with data loading. As I mentioned, this is client side. That is, on the client, when we use the client router, we have a hydration fallback and we render it. We also have server side when we use the same loader and we render everything. Static simply means that we need certain pages of ours. We see here that we have some specific product page. That is, we may have many of these products and we simply render the one we need by its ID in our config, that is in our file React router config tcs, which is, well, here in our pre-render function, we specify the paths that need to be pre-rendered. Next, we work with our actions. So as for actions, again, on the client, we have them, and we also have server actions that are handled on the server. That is, we have actions on the server, and then here it shows how to work with our form. You can work here either through a regular form or by using our useSubmit hook. So we have some kind of form, and useSubmit simply triggers the handling not just for forms, actually. We can use it even without a form. The main point is working through IT if we don't have a form and want to call it from some function or handler or wherever we need. In other words, to handle a specific action, we use our useSubmit. Next, regarding navigation, everything is standard as before. Navlink is used to conveniently style our tabs and so on. Those have remained the same. Navigation link is used for highlighting. Linking is as usual, meaning redirecting to different pages without reloading, so it works like in a single page application. Everything remains as it was. Forms and components are there so that our form works, allowing us to intercept the action of the form. Redirect is used so that in our functions we can simply specify which page the redirect should go to. And useNavigate is our hook for working with navigation, getting more detailed information, and redirecting the user wherever necessary, including in hooks, in some utility functions, and so on and so forth. Here we have data mode, which works with a format that involves some object or function. And then there's also working in the component format. But unfortunately, in the component format, we don't have actions or loaders, but that's how it is. If we want to use actions and loaders, we either use data mode or the mode with the framework. After that, we have our hooks. In fact, when it comes to hooks, there haven't really been any significant changes. So nothing much has been added except for our use matches. It's needed precisely for that is it allows you to get data about the current root matches, which is useful for accessing loader data, meaning our loader data and the data of parent or child roots, as well as the roots handle property. In addition to use matches, another such addition is use routes. It provides the ability to use a root object instead of a component, returning a React element to render the root tree, or in our case, null. Next, we have data routers, meaning our routers. Overall, nothing has really changed. Our hydration routers, router provider, static router provider, creating our routers using objects again, a declarative approach where we specify our components and then the utils, which again haven't really changed either. And roughly speaking, some good practices regarding how to implement certain functionality. Here you find answers to questions. That's basically it. For more in-depth material, help, consultations, approaches, or code examples. So again, there's still more to check out. All of that is on the Telegram channel. Just go there and subscribe. That's pretty much it. We covered React Router version 7. Let's wrap it up. And don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and stay in touch.